Hi, and welcome to our next video on Semantics Pragmatics. In this video, we are going to talk about linguistic landscapes. This is also going to be the second and last video in the block on other aspects of meaning. Okay, so when we talk about linguistic landscapes, what we mean is the fact that on public and commercial signs in a given territory or region, that can really be a region or a city, for example, different languages are visible and salient. When we study linguistic landscapes, it is a combination of sociolinguistics, of semiotics, semantics, pragmatics, but also geography and language policy. We're going to see how that works in a minute. The study of linguistic landscapes began in the 1990s and are continuing and flourishing until today. When we look at linguistic landscapes and how they are formed in the different areas and regions, we very often have to do with language ideologies, and most importantly then with the two big ideologies or complexes of ideologies connected with multilingualism and monolingualism. Particularly interesting are linguistic landscapes in linguistic conflict areas. Just to name a couple of examples, we have Quebec in Canada, where there's French and English alongside each other, or Catalonia in Spain, where there's Spanish and Catalonian, Belgium with its Dutch-speaking and French-speaking and German-speaking communities, or in German, the Sorbian-speaking areas, or South Slovakia with the Hungarian minority and Slovakian-speaking majority, South Tyrol with Italian, German, or Ireland, where you have the different roles of English and Irish, and so forth. Another particularly interesting example of linguistic landscapes, of areas where linguistic landscapes are particularly interesting, are multilingual cities, such as, for instance, Berlin, but also other big cities, but not necessarily also big. Other cities where multilingual, where different language communities live together. Another important concept that we're going to talk about, or that is important when we study linguistic landscapes, is the so-called imagined community. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, so when we begin to talk about linguistic landscapes, let's have a look at one example. This example is a cash point in Friedrichshain, in Berlin. It's an ATM machine in a Späti, and when you want to get money from that machine, you'll get this information, right? You see there a short sentence saying that you should insert your card, and this piece of information is there in German, English, French, Spanish, Italian, Turkish, and Dutch. And this is not only visible for you or understandable for you if you know the languages, but there is also a small flag of the country that is supposed to represent the speakers of the language. So you have German flag for German, British flag for English speakers, French for French speakers, and so forth. The use of flags to represent languages is another thing tied to linguistic ideologies, but we're not going to talk about that in this context. Right. So this is something. This is a small example of linguistic landscapes. Right. So you have a number of languages in a certain hierarchy. You have German at the very top, and you have the Dutch at the very bottom. Then, if you wait a second, you'll see another message that this cache point will give you, and this is this thing, right? So this changes. The one thing that you see at one screen is please insert your card, and the other screen is ink protection for more security, telling you that there's no point breaking in the machine because the money that is inside will be destroyed if you do that. And here, interestingly, one thing is you don't see the flags, but the more important thing here is what languages are used for this message. So you have German at the very top. Then you have English. So those are two languages that you also had on the previous screen. And then, this is interesting, you have Russian, or perhaps Bulgarian, I'm not sure at this moment. Then you have Romanian, and then you have Polish. And now this is interesting. It's not interesting because of the content, but it's more interesting because of what the people who did that, who wrote that, what they thought, and to whom were they speaking, right? So on the one hand, they were speaking to French, English, Spanish, Italian, Turkish, and Dutch-speaking, probably tourists visiting Berlin. And at the same time, or on the other hand, they were speaking to Romanian, Polish, and German-speaking criminals who would try to break in the machine. So, right? And this also says something about the ideas that are connected with linguistic expressions in the city. Okay, but let's move on. Now, let's talk quickly about imagined communities. So imagined communities, and the idea of a community that can be imagined, is based on the concept of social constructivism. Social constructivism is the theory or model, or describes the fact, basically, that social identities of individuals, of individual people, of individual speakers, and social categories as such as nations, ethnicities, and other groups that we can belong to, are produced and later reproduced in discourse. This means that social identities of individuals and the social categories do not exist prior to language use, but they are the outcome of language use. By speaking, we actually we express our belonging to a certain group, and we also express our social identity, right? How we want that others perceive us. And the prime example of an imagined community would be sort of a national community, right? So as Fuller writes in her text, right, although a member of a nation cannot possibly know all or even most of their fellow members, there is a sense of community, a sense of belonging, right? And there is when we construct this belonging to a certain community, and in terms of linguistic landscapes, we draw on social meanings and associations of particular lexical items, phrases, codes, to create an image and identity for whoever is creating the signs in different languages. Right. When we talk now, we've been talking about the what different meaning the different languages in the linguistic landscape have. And when we talk about that, we can distinguish between three orders of indexicality. And this is actually more simple than it sounds like. And what we have is we have the first order indexicality, which tells us that there are certain linguistic practices that we can observe as linguists, for example. Then in the second order indexicality, we are in a situation where the speakers themselves perceive their own linguistic practice. It is then a reflexive linguistic practice, right? So I know what I speak and how I speak and why I do it. And then we have third order indexicality, when linguistic forms some linguistic forms are perceived as being emblems, as having as sort of indexing a certain style. We can use language to ideologically conceptualize something, to express our belonging to a certain group. Right. And the main point here is basically that indexicality is social meaning, right? Or the social meaning of whatever we say or write, right? And if you remember what you heard in the, first or second session of your introductory classes to linguistics, you'll know that there is this Saussurian model of linguistic sign with a signifier on the one hand and signified on the other. You have the form and the meaning, right? So, and the prime example here would be the word or the expression for tree, or in German, the Baum, right? And they both mean the same. But this is not the whole story for that, right? If you say something like tree, or Baum, there is another layer, indexicality here, right? So if you say, instead of a tree, if you say Baum, it also expresses sort of the meaning of German and everything that is associated with that, right? And of course, this is just a very tiny example, but there are, it gets more complicated. So there is not only the referential meaning of whatever we say, so what we want to say, but or pragmatic meaning, what we want to achieve by what we say, but there are also indexical, there is also indexical meaning of what we are saying, the social meaning, how it gets interpreted and what are the connotations of whatever we're saying. And these connotations then tap into language ideologies. And language ideologies are sort of, it doesn't have to be something very complicated and constructed on the state level, but when we in linguistics, sociolinguistics, talk about language ideologies, we mean basically any set of beliefs about languages. And when we talk about linguistic landscapes, it's not only beliefs about languages, about spoken languages, but here predominantly also about written languages and about graphic elements, right? And if we now have a look at here, right, so we have on the on the left-hand side, we see runic symbols used. This one, by the way, reads dust for some reason. Right, so but it's not really important what it says, because not many people will be able to decipher it, but it's sort of the way how you write it also represents something, and it also has an indexical meaning. Right, the same thing for the picture in the middle, where it reads "Ye old curiosity." It actually should read "Ye old curiosity shop," and it's sort of, this would be another big topic. This sort of archaic looking inscriptions in English. It basically says the old curiosity shop, right? But by adding the E somewhere and using Y instead of TH, you also add something, a connotation to whatever you're saying. And then on the right-hand side, we have an old abandoned pub, a Biergarten in Berlin, when they're saying that they have Berliner Kindle on tap, but written in the old Sütterlin script, right? And it also says something about that. Even if you can't really read it, it has this, nowadays, it sort of conveys something like, this is old, right? Because nobody uses it anymore, or not really. And if yes, then only in private, I don't know, postcards, for example. If you write them to an older person, or an older person might use that on postcards to another older person, but you would not have it on a newly opened cafe. Okay. Now, when we talk about linguistic landscapes in Berlin, there are different linguistic landscapes that we can distinguish. One thing that we can distinguish, for instance, is the official signage in Berlin, right? So signs that are put in place by the city or by the authorities in the city. And this may be something, things that are informations, or things that forbid you or ask you not to do something, and so forth. And here the basic things that we can see are, on the one hand, the language hierarchy, right? So what languages are, so how prominent are certain languages, how salient they are, right? And here in all cases, you see German is number one. And then it depends sort of on what you, in what context that sign is used, right? So if we take a look at the Heideck sign in the middle, right? You have the German sentence at the very top, and then you have Arabic, and you have Turkish, and you have Polish. Why? Well, very probably because many of the inhabitants of that area speak those languages, and that's why it's functional, so to speak, good to use those languages. If you take a look at the sort of sprayed message that you should wear a mask, you see there again, German is the prominent number one language. Then you have English I know I would speculate that it's because of for tourists. And then you have Turkish and again Arabic, right? If we take a look at the metro sign at the left-hand side, at the left-hand bottom, in the left-hand bottom corner of the slide, you see German, number 1, English, number 2, and then there is, surprising perhaps, number 3 is French, right? And that's the metro station Unter den Linden. And then for some reason, if no dogs are allowed, and this is in Torstraße in Mitte, there are again English, German, Russian, French, and Spanish. Why those languages? Not really sure. And that brings us to the second thing that you can have a look at when you look at linguistic landscapes in Berlin, and that is what languages are actually used, right? So what languages and why those languages? So the one thing is the language repertoire, so what languages are used, and then in what positions do those languages actually have on the sign and in the whole landscape. Then there are also other sort of less regulated signs in Berlin that make up the linguistic landscape of Berlin. And those are private signs, right? And there are different types of these private signs. It can be really sort of signs that tell you, I know that a shop is open, as the one in the middle for a bookshop. Or you have then sort of stickers or something like that put wherever people want to put them, right? They have different functions. Sometimes it's not really a private sign written somewhere with chalk, but it's really the name of the shop. Can also have different linguistic aspects. Or it can be something similar to the first open sign, where it says that in a certain period of time the shop will be closed, and then you also see the same. So you have, on the one hand, Arabic, right, and German, but here, interestingly, you have Arabic is here number 1, right? It has the prominent upper position in the linguistic landscape of that shop. Okay. Then again, what you can distinguish when we talk about, when you analyze the linguistic landscape of Berlin, is why certain languages are chosen. This is something that I've already touched upon a couple of seconds ago. Here, these are the posters from the Dewe enteignen campaign, right? Where you have their posters are in different languages, and you have one in English, one in German, one in Russian, one in Arabic, and there's also one in Turkish that I don't have on that slide. But here, this is very easily decoded why these languages are used, because those are the languages that many inhabitants in Berlin are using, right? The sort of slightly, sort of funnily enough, not all people who can read that can then really sign the petition, because you have to be a German citizen if you want to sign the petition. But anyway, right, so people speaking those languages will get the message. At the same time, you can also have sort of multilingual linguistic landscapes, or multilingual signs, or signs that actually combine different languages in one, that don't really have a function, sort of a communicative function that tells you, okay, there is something that you have to know, and this is in the language that you speak, so that you can understand it. But there are also emblematic uses of languages, as in, for example, these two cases. The first one is an ad for an insurance, and it tells you in English get insured faster than you can say Hundehaftpflichtversicherung, right? And you can also sort of guess why they've chosen that. Either sort of right, so the German bit tells you what it is about, but this is also conveyed by the picture of a dog, right? And so you get the idea that it's an insurance for dogs. But even if you don't know any German, you'll get the idea that is transported here, right? So the German has very long words, and it will take some time to pronounce that word, but you can get the insurance even faster, right? So it really takes almost no time. And then in the other picture, we can see a sort of a German-Czech multilingual sign picture by the BVG when they ceased to use the old Tatra trams, and then they've written in German sort of that they're not going to use them anymore, and then used sort of goodbye written in Czech, right? And not that many people really understand Czech, and they will probably not even recognize it, but it's simply an emblematic use of the language to index the fact that those Tatra trams originally come from what is now Czechia. Okay. And then there are also other linguistic landscapes in Berlin and in other cities that are really interesting, that are not really on the streets or in shops or official signs, and they are also not commodified. They are not used in order to, to get more customers or to forbid something. And those are languages used on cemeteries, graveyards. And here I have three pictures from two different Jewish cemeteries in Berlin, one in Weißensee and the other one at Schönhauser Allee. And you see here the use of one thing is there are also different scripts, as you can see on the right-hand side, right? So Hebrew and German or Latin script, and then also different languages. And even when it comes to names, right? So you have here on the two pictures on the left, you see first Hungarian and then German, and then the other way around on the second one. Right. And here it says something probably more about the identity, the social identity about of the person who died, right? If you remember what we said in the beginning, the social constructivism, about social constructivism, things are not intrinsically what they are how they are constructed by language use, right? And here by writing the name of the deceased person in two languages, it tells us something about that person. Very probably was that person also bilingual and somehow belonging to two different language communities, Hungarian and Hungarian and German. Okay. Another thing, up until now, I've been talking about different languages when it comes to linguistic landscapes, but this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You can also have different varieties of one language that can also be combined, right? And here I have three examples of the local Berlin variety of German, or something non-standard varieties of German, right? And there are two examples of sort of private but rather official signage, right? With Kikma Berlin, Vienna is calling, an Ich kauf bei Lehmann, right? So businesses who want to somehow express their belonging to the local Berlin community. And then on the picture on the left-hand side, Obst und Gemüse befindet sich im Laden drinne. You see that drinne, the sort of non-standard, I'm not sure about really Berlin, but somehow non-standard use of German, right? And that also says something about the person who wrote that or about the shop, and also conveys meaning. It's also socially indexical, a third order indexical. Okay, so what have we learned in this video? So we know that social identities and social categories do not exist a priori prior to language use, but they are the outcomes of language use. We also know that words not only have whatever truth values or referential meanings, but words, expressions, sentences, and also languages have indexical social meaning. And we also know that language users, people, have certain beliefs, certain ideas about languages and about language, and that means that they have language ideologies, right? So they have certain ideas that are tied to not only certain words in their own language, but also to other languages, and this can be used in linguistic landscapes. For instance, multilingualism, monolingualism are sort of these two big topics, and then also a certain hierarchy of languages, right? So many people have the idea that certain languages are sort of more positively assessed than other languages, right? And now think back what we've seen in on the first slide when I showed you the ATM machine, where you had different languages for people who want to get money the usual way by inserting a card, and different languages for people who would, as the authors of the message thought, would want to break in to the ATM machine, right? So there is a certain hierarchy of languages. And all these things are visible and therefore also analyzable in the form of linguistic landscapes, of the official or private signage in a given territory, in a given city, in this case, in Berlin. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in our next live session.